Hi, and welcome back to these talks on the highest learning. It's really great that we can get together every week. Hopefully, the tools and the tips that we learn through the text can be put to good use during the week. So, last week, we talked about the first priority, which was to detect our thoughts when they arise. So, try to nip them in the bud, and then to be able to evaluate them, which is called perfecting knowledge. This week, we'll talk about the next action, which is making intention sincere. You'll notice, of course, that the highest learning is very logically structured. So it's got two aims, further clarified as 8 actions, and each of these actions are explored in the text sequentially. So this idea of making intention sincere is very interesting. Last time we spoke about intentions, we said that intentions are sort of where our thoughts are directed. Now, today we'll talk about what it means to be sincere and how exactly we can apply this in our life. The passage is actually quite long, so what I've done is broken it down into smaller parts. So we'll look at the first part. It says, making intention sincere means not deceiving oneself, like disliking an offensive smell or liking a beautiful sight. This is called inner fulfillment. For this reason, an exemplary person must be cautious when alone. So it begins with a very succinct definition. Making intention sincere is to not deceive oneself. Deception is to cover up. So not deceiving oneself is to not cover up our enlightened virtue. Now, we know that this enlightened virtue has an all-encompassing compassion, a moral greatness that's equal to that of heaven and earth, Mother Nature. So able to accommodate all things and see self and others as one entity. But the enlightened virtue also has an innate wisdom, the ability to distinguish right from wrong. You could call it an innate moral sense. So we could call it our conscience, for example. Now, not deceiving oneself in simple terms would be not going against our conscience, not doing something that we know to be wrong. Now, if we put it together with the first 2 actions, you'll see that when thoughts arise, we detect them, we evaluate them, and then we follow through. So making intention sincere is following through on the idea that, if this thought is for others, it's correct, we'll just do it. There's no sort of barrier in the middle. So we are in complete accordance with the first 2 actions. And this, you could say that this moral sense is likened to our other senses of sight and smell, which is what the text states here. So when we smell something offensive, we immediately dislike it, right? And when we see something beautiful, like the flowers here, we immediately are fond and enjoy it. So this moral sense should also be the same in that we respond instinctively without having to think or force ourselves. Now, there are quite a few English translations of the highest learning, but there are very limited sort of explanations in English of this text. Brian Van Norden, an American sinologist, has provided a very good explanation about these lines in one of his monographs. And he talks about how this idea of disliking an offensive smell, a good example is if you take out a bottle of milk, open the lid, and you smell it, you realize it's spoiled, right? So you're immediately repulsed. You don't have to motivate yourself, you don't have to force yourself not to drink it, right? So this idea of making intention sincere, it combines the idea of cognition, so knowing that the milk has gone off, and also motivation, which is an action. You don't want to drink it. So it's cognition and motivation, or knowledge and action combined. And so that's the extent of sincerity. which is very well illustrated by a passage in the Analects. Confucius said, "Upon seeing the kind, pursue it as if unable to reach. Upon seeing the unkind, reject it as if touching hot water." So you can see in the very first line about seeing something kind, there are actually quite a few micro processes in the sense that first, you have to recognize this as something that's good or virtuous, right? And then you have to admire it, want to emulate it, and also do so with a sense of urgency. So recognition, admiration, emulation, and the sense of urgency, all of these thoughts and feelings should happen simultaneously. And similarly, when you see something unkind, you have to recognize it as well, feel repulsed, and avoid it, and completely put it out of your mind. Now, obviously, this is not just something that we see. It's actually when our thoughts arise. If it's a kind thought, yes, we recognize it, we continue. But if it's an unkind thought, we completely let it go, put it out of our mind, reorientate our thoughts, refocus our thoughts. So it's still addressing the level of our thoughts. So the interesting thing about this, as we can see here, is it seems like a very advanced level, doesn't it? This idea that, it would happen automatically. And for most of us, a lot of good habits need to be built up over time such that it becomes automatic. The question then is, what is really at stake? If we constantly go against our conscience, do things that we know to be wrong, so what? Well, what is at stake? The simple answer, many things. We could have a much more productive, efficient, successful, and fulfilling life if our intentions were sincere. Because as you can see, if we are not sincere, what happens is that we have this inner conflict. We're pulled in two directions, selfish desire or the enlightened virtue. So for self or for others. And if we cover up the fact that we are, in fact, going against this enlightened virtue, going against our conscience, then it becomes tiring over time. It also gives rise to other feelings like guilt, regret, shame, anger, etc. And so this arises because of this inner conflict when we're not sincere, when we're not in complete concordance with what we know to be right. And so that's what the next sentence in the text tells us. If we are sincere, then this is called inner fulfillment. This inner fulfillment is when we can think, act, and speak in complete harmony with our nature, with our enlightened virtue. So we're doing what we should be doing. We're doing what we know is right. And you can understand, of course, that if you can do that, it gives rise to a sense of inner satisfaction and contentment. It's a kind of happiness that is very different and not related at all to our external factors. It's a kind of happiness that's very different from the happiness based on our senses. So, for example, if we have eat something that we like, our favorite food, well, we get a temporary sort of happiness, but that sort of ceases as soon as we finish the bowl, we finish eating it. So this inner fulfillment is something that springs from within and sort of leads to an inner peace, a sort of tranquility, contentment. It's very different and it's much more self-sustaining. You can sort of understand this from the famous first line of the Analects, in which Confucius says, "To learn and constantly apply this learning, is it not a joy?" I find it very interesting because, I think it'd be very hard pressed to find a high school student who could say this about their own learning. And of course, Confucius is not talking about any learning. He's talking about the highest learning. So a learning that is very much related to our daily lives. So if we put into practice, we'll notice improvements immediately. And that's the kind of joy that he's talking about, this joy of inner fulfillment. And it's not something that is only seen in the very first line of the Analects. In fact, every time Confucius sort of talks about himself, talks about his learning, he seems to be brimming with joy. He describes himself in one instance as being so enthusiastic he forgets to eat, and also forgets that he's getting old. In fact, when he's in dire straits, when he meets with difficulty, he continues to have this inner confidence and peace. So you can see that this inner fulfillment is not at all related to our external circumstances, nor is it related to people around us. So the next bit tells us that it's for this reason, so for the reason of innate fulfillment, being able to experience this satisfaction and contentment, that an exemplary person must be cautious when alone. So here we are introduced to a very important archetype in the Confucian texts, the exemplary person. And they are often sort of used in contrast with a petty person. So two archetypes that will commonly meet. And it's sort of a teaching tool that Confucius uses in terms of trying to tell his students who to follow, who to emulate. So the exemplary person is someone who is cultivating themselves. They sort of emulate past exemplars, and they want to be exemplary. They want to become a sage. In contrast, the petty person is someone who's not cultivating, is not learning, and simply does whatever they want. And often it is following their selfish desires. So the amazing thing about this exemplary person and this petty person, of course, is that no one is 100% perfect, and no one is 100% imperfect. So really, for us, we sometimes follow the exemplary part of ourselves, and sometimes we follow the petty part of ourselves. You could say that the two types, or the two archetypes, are really two voices in our head. It's sort of pulling us in different directions. And these texts, the classics and Confucius, it encourages us to follow the exemplary person, to emulate them, and also to really follow the exemplary part of ourselves, you could say. So what does the exemplary person do? They must be cautious when alone. Now, if we look at the wording here, you'll notice that it doesn't say that the exemplary person wishes to be cautious, hopes to be cautious. It says that they must be cautious. And that means that there's really no room for negotiation. It means that it should be done. So this cautiousness when alone is actually a very important concept in late imperial Confucian learning. And it was so important that Emperor Kangxi, who ruled China in the 17th and 18th centuries, and considered one of China's greatest emperors, he noted in his court maxims, so words of wisdom for his royal court, that this concept of being cautious when alone is found in both the highest learning and the practice of the mean, so 2 of the 4 books. And he said that this is the most important moral conduct of the sages and worthies. So the sages are people who have manifested their enlightened virtue, love the people, and resting in utmost goodness. And the worthies are those who are sort of one level down. So 2 types of very exemplary people that we should be emulating. So this is what they do. They are cautious when alone. So exactly what does that mean? Now, cautiousness is not what we think in terms of the English sense, but if we look at the form of the Chinese character, it might help us understand a bit more about this concept. Being cautious when alone, the left character is pronounced in Chinese as Shin, and it's made up of 2 parts, a left part and a right part. The left part is the character for heart-mind. The right part is the character for true or real. And essentially being cautious, based on the form of the character, tells us that we have to be true to our original heart-mind, true to our enlightened virtue. So according with this conscience or moral sense. So being cautious doesn't mean being afraid or anxious and not wanting to do things. It means that we have to be careful and concentrated. So it's like when we try out a recipe for the very first time. We have to be very careful, measure out all the quantities with concentration, and also be careful with cooking time because we want to produce something that's delicious. Now, being cautious when alone is the same. We have to pay attention to the details of what we're thinking, what we're doing, and especially when alone. Now, why does it single out the fact that we have to be cautious when alone? Well, this is actually a high-risk period, if you think about it. We think that no one's looking, no one knows, and that's when we think we can do whatever we want. As they say, when the cat's away, the mice will play. So being cautious when alone is a real litmus test for whether or not our intentions are sincere. Because if we can do the same when we're in front of others or when we're by ourselves, it means that we're on the way to really making our intentions sincere. So that's why we have to be more careful than usual. I think, well, when I read this, of course, I thought it was interesting on two fronts. The first is that this particular observation is such an acute observation of the human condition. And the person who sort of recorded this, compiled this text, really sort of observed something that was happening in the Warring States period, the time of Confucius, 2,000 years ago, but it's just as relevant to us now. And it goes to show that really we all have this enlightened virtue, it's innate, but at the same time, all humans have these habits too. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting is that the compiler cared enough to record this so that people, future generations, could learn from this and be reminded of what's important in life. And it's not something that's very, very profound, but it's something that really hits the nail on the head because it's something that we can all do. It's very practical and really highlights this high-risk period. Now, on further inspection, you'll realize, of course, that it's still talking about evaluating our thoughts, because in some ways, public scrutiny is not a very accurate indicator of what's right and wrong, in the sense that, people's opinions are subjective. They're always changing. They change with the weather. So the most accurate indicator of an evaluation of ourselves is essentially ourselves in relation to the guidelines that we see in the classics. So Zhu Xi, in his commentary, he doesn't talk about cautiousness when physically alone. He talks about being cautious of what we alone know and what others don't. In other words, what's happening in our thoughts, in our mind. Now, I put this photo here because it reminds me of a story that really illustrates this point. And it's a story about a provincial governor who ruled who administrated Henan in the 18th century. His name was Ye Cunren, and he was known to be of very upstanding character, very honest person. When he resigned, his colleagues wanted to give him a lot of gifts, and so they loaded up his boat at night so that no one would know. But true to form, he declined the gifts. He wrote a poem thanking them for their great kindness. But the last two lines of the poem explains that he didn't decline the gifts because he was afraid of others knowing. He declined the gifts because he was afraid of his own conscience. So we might be able to conceal things from others, but it's impossible to conceal things from ourselves. We know what we've thought, what we've said, and what we've done. And that's why the spirit of being cautious when alone is not in being physically alone, but in really keeping check on these thoughts and being careful about what we're thinking. Now, clearly you might say, well, this is quite advanced. And in actual fact, if we think about the first interpretation of being physically alone, that in a way is a very good starting point, because it's when we are alone that oftentimes the thoughts and these habits sort of come out. So that is still a very good starting point. So this is what the exemplary person does. Now, what do you think the petty person would do when they're alone? Well, that's what the next passage tells us. It states here, the petty person conducts misdeeds when at ease. There is nothing they may not do. When observed by an exemplary person, however, they will conceal their misdeeds and exhibit their good deeds. But others see through them, as if to their very liver and lungs. Of what use is concealment? So, in contrast, the petty person, when they don't have any work to do, when they're unoccupied, when they're by themselves, they will stop at nothing to enjoy themselves and they'll do anything. However, in the presence of an exemplary person, it awakens their conscience and they feel ashamed. Well, why is that? Well, it shows us that everyone has a conscience. Everyone has this enlightened virtue. And even if the petty person doesn't read the highest learning, has never heard about this thing called an innate virtue or enlightened virtue, they still have it. And so when they see the exemplary person is a demonstration of perfected knowledge. It's like providing a standard, like when you look in a mirror and you see your blemishes. So it awakens this conscience in them and they realize what they've done is wrong. But look at what they do. Rather than focusing on the root cause of the problem, which is their knowledge, their thoughts, their values, they instead work on their appearance, the superficialities. So they try to cover up, they boast about their strengths and parade their good deeds. So, how does that work? Does it actually work? The simple answer is no. People will see right through you. And in fact, particularly people who are cultivated, because the more that we examine and evaluate our own thoughts and feelings, the more we are able to infer that others may think or feel the same way in the same situation. So those who are cultivated are very easily able to read the minds of others and understand what people might be thinking. A very good way of understanding this is like when we learn a language. Right? When you first start out learning a language, we don't know very much. And so if someone speaks like, 2 or 3 sentences, you think that they're really advanced. But when you become fluent and you hear others speak in this language, you'll know exactly who's the beginner and who's the intermediate level. So in the same way, the further that we've walked on this way of highest learning, the further that we've practiced and cultivated, the more we'll be able to understand the pitfalls and how others might be going on their journey. And we'll be able to really understand them and see and be able to judge them. Obviously, of course, this idea of reading others or knowing others is not because we want to manipulate them or be able to pass judgment on them. The most important thing is that when we're sensitive to their needs and their feelings, we're more able to help them, to be able to, do and say the right things at the right time so that we can help them improve themselves. So that's part and parcel of our own cultivation. So back to the text, yes, others can see right through. It really doesn't work. But that's really not the most important point. The most important point is that we are the biggest losers in this. We are just kidding ourselves, because the moment that we cover up is the moment that we stop improving and identifying our own faults. And we're really deceiving ourselves. Because when circumstances change, we're back to the same sort of being by ourselves again. These habits will come out, these thoughts will come out, and we'll just continue perpetuating them. So The most important thing, of course, is we will never be able to experience that inner fulfillment, that sort of settled mind, a mind that's really, truly at peace. So the next part then is, well, this kind of keeping and making our intention sincere is a lot of inner work, isn't it? Always being vigilant and evaluating these thoughts and seeing them through. But what are the results of this, and what's the payoff? It says here, this refers to sincere within being manifest without. Hence, the exemplary person must be cautious when alone. Master Tsing said, 10 eyes stare and 10 hands point. How terrifying. So essentially it tells us that whatever we're thinking inside is going to be very obvious and manifest on the outside through our words, our deeds, and even our appearance. So that's why the text here reiterates the same line from before, that the exemplary person must be cautious. Now, if there's repetition, it means this is a very important point. So this idea, this concept was key in Confucian learning. And here it also provides or cites Master Tsing, who's a very prominent student of Confucius, but also known as a paragon of virtue. But this particular sentence has been interpreted in different ways. And I guess from a practical point of view, you could think of it as the mindset of the exemplary person. That, wherever they are, they always think that there are people looking at them, judging them. And so they naturally feel alert and they're more vigilant. So it's a technique by which they can make sure that they're cautious when alone. And Master Tsing, as we know, was someone who constantly reflected upon himself and made progress in the way of the highest learning. So this is something that we can learn from him and from his example. The next part then provides us with some metaphors on this concept, this idea of what's cause and effect, what's within and without. It states, wealth enriches the home, virtue enriches the self. When the mind is magnanimous, the body is at ease. Therefore, the exemplary person must make their intention sincere. So it's just like when a person is rich, they tend to live in lavish surroundings. And that's because with their wealth, they can afford these very decadent furnishings. Similarly, when a person has great virtue, it enriches the self. It means that we can tell from their words, their deeds, and their appearance and manner. So what is this virtue? Well, it comes from within, it comes from their mind. And their mind is magnanimous, meaning that they are big-hearted, that they're able to accommodate others, to forgive and forget, rather than be caught up in petty concerns about us and them and, anger and resentment. So because they are big-hearted and generous, they have this mind that sees others and themselves as one entity, then their body is at ease, meaning that they will have physical and mental well-being. So it has flow-on effects to their health. And so it says the exemplary person must make their intention sincere, which is the final line in this passage. And again, telling us that, if we want to be exemplary, then this is something that we have to do. And I guess when I read this, it reminded me of a particular passage in the Dizugui, which states that a person of good character is highly respected. Respect is not based on external appearances. A capable person will naturally have a good reputation. People are not won over by boasting or self-praise. So clearly, the cause and effect here is very obvious. What is the cause of being respected? Well, it's not how we look, what we wear. It's actually our good character. So we should work on our character, on our thoughts, our intentions, our mind, etc. And similarly, we attain a good reputation not by learning choice phrases or through public relations, but through being a capable person, by working on improving our competencies so that we can help and contribute to others. So you can see very clearly what are our priorities here. And I think this is well illustrated in the example of Confucius. So here is a conversation between two of his students, Ziqing and Zigong. And Ziqing is asking his senior, Zigong, that when Confucius is traveling around the States, he's very certain he's often able to learn about the political affairs. Does he seek such information, or do others just sort of provide this information voluntarily? Now, Zigong, we know, is someone who's very eloquent. He knows, of course, that he can't say that Confucius is seeking this information, because then it sounds like Confucius just wants a job, or, is in it for the fame and the fortune of political appointment. But at the same time, he can't say that Confucius doesn't seek this information, because clearly we know that Confucius wanted to sort of convince the rulers of his political vision for a benevolent government. So what does he say? Zigong says, the master goes about it by being gentle, kind, respectful, frugal, and deferential. And these 5 attributes often known as the 5 virtues of Confucius. He says, the master's way of seeking is different from that of others. So how does Confucius attain this information? It's through his inner cultivation, such that he has, through his manner, this very clear picture of someone who has very noble character. So when he visits a state, people just sort of recognize that he's someone of noble character, and they will probably make arrangements for him to understand about the politics and also have an audience with the ruler. So he doesn't need to, network or make connections. He goes about it in a very natural way, simply from this sincerity within being manifest without. So ultimately, if we recap on the passage, we'll see that there are various ideas in this passage here about making intentions sincere. The first is to not deceive oneself. Deception is duplicity. So that's when we have this inner conflict. We're at 2 minds, being torn between our selfish desires or, doing the right thing and according with our conscience. If we are able to accord with our conscience, we're able to be sincere, then we will experience fulfillment, a sense of satisfaction. How do we start? Where do we start? It's to be cautious when we're alone, physically alone, but then obviously working up to the point where we're always cautious and always able to evaluate our thoughts. Well, what are the outcomes of this? Ultimately, it's going to be obvious to everyone, but it'll be most obvious to ourselves first, because when our mind is magnanimous, we will experience improvements in our mental and physical well-being. So therefore, you can say that this idea of sincerity here, it tells us not only what it is, how to do it, but also the benefits. Now, up to this point, you're probably thinking, yes, this is very logical, very reasonable, but has anyone actually sort of achieved the highest learning, and what is that like? So the compilers of this text predicted that we'd have these questions, and so the next section is really a series of extracts from 2 authoritative texts in the Confucian canon, the Odes and the Documents, and sort of draws out these exemplars, so very famous figures in pre-imperial Chinese history. You can see, obviously, these are sage rulers or exemplary rulers taken from very key texts. Now, because these series of lectures are introductory in nature, we won't have time to cover all of these extracts and delve into who these people are. And so what I want to do is just focus on one of these people today, one of these exemplars. And hopefully, in the future, we'll be able to if we have time to provide an explanation of the highest learning in its entirety. But for these lectures anyway, simply an introduction. So who I'm going to focus on today is King Tang of the Shang dynasty. And we're introduced to him because the inscription on his basin has been recorded in the highest learning. So it says, the basin inscription of Tang states, truly new each day, new every day, and again, new each day. So what does this basin look like? Well, this is a replica of the basin. It's a sort of bronze vessel. And I don't know if you can see, but at the very bottom of that basin, there's sort of an inscription. So what it looks like is the rubbing that you can see on the right-hand side. So it's very different from the Chinese characters that we use today. It's an ancient script called bronze script, which was used at that time, obviously on bronze vessels. And what it means is translated below. But I find this very interesting because the items that we use and the appliances that we use these days tend to be for one specific purpose only, like, you know, our desk lamp or our mirror. But in the past, you know, they served more than one purpose. This basin was for, you know, washing, but also at the same time but served to provide a daily reminder for King Tang, which is very, very useful. So you can see here that this reminder is like his personal motto, something that he sees every time he washes himself, and that would be on a very regular basis. And so he's often reminded. Now, what does it mean? Well, in a nutshell, this inscription is telling us to improve ourselves, to make progress every day and do it unceasingly. But, you know, you can see obviously there's 3 sentences, so it's almost like 3 phases, right? So we can look at that in more detail. The first phase, truly new each day, is when we sort of motivate ourselves to get out of the rut, to really confront ourselves and be honest. What are our faults? What are our deficiencies and weaknesses? List them all out and begin with the hardest, begin with the worst, because if we can overcome that, then not only will we experience, you know, great satisfaction, but also the others will be very easy. So truly new each day is really sort of getting yourself to change. And I think, you know, rather than talk about it theoretically, we can use a very specific example, for example, like learning another language. So when we learn another language, we have to develop various skills like speaking, reading, writing, and listening. And oftentimes, many people say that speaking is the worst, the hardest. But why is that? Well, it's because, you know, it's fine when we're in our room practicing in front of the mirror, but when we want to talk with someone, we're worried that we'll be embarrassed, that they might not understand or they'll laugh at us. And because of that, we end up not talking. So we never improve. Now, I think that this basin inscription provides us with a strategy to overcome this. So first of all, truly new each day. Take each day as a fresh start. So whatever happened yesterday, whatever you said wrong or pronounced wrong yesterday, leave it behind. Today is a fresh day. Don't think about, you know, what the other person, how the other person responded, or you know, how they couldn't understand. Today is a new start, and we leave behind yesterday's emotional baggage. So if we can do that, we can start the day with this commitment to communicate, this commitment to, you know, make sure that we get our message across. And if we change our mindset, then in fact, the way that people respond to us will also change. So that's really how you could think of the very first phase. Truly new each day. Then the second phase is new every day. So we've possibly made some progress, but don't be complacent and keep up the momentum. In fact, we take each day as a new day, as a fresh start, but even more importantly, we could even take each moment on a moment-to-moment basis. We could see it as a new beginning. So yes, I might have pronounced something wrong before, but right here, right now, I'm going to start afresh and just learn from my mistakes, learn the lesson, and then try again. And oftentimes, what's stopping us is the noise in our head, these thoughts that tell us, it's too difficult, I can't do it, people are going to laugh. Um, it's sort of all these doubts that we have that stop us from progressing and it sort of creates barriers when really, in reality, there may be no barriers. So new each day is, keep up the momentum and think of, you could even think of each moment as being a new moment where you start afresh. And then ultimately, again, new each day is when you don't stop until you reach the finish line, until you achieve your goal, which is unceasing, really. When you're learning a language, for example, if you're learning English, then after normal English, there's academic English. If you're learning Chinese, it's not only spoken Chinese, written Chinese, but literary Chinese. So, you can keep going, and there's no limit. It's limitless, your potential. So you can see, of course, that with something like this reminder every day, that you can really motivate yourself. And it can be applied to any habit, any problem, any skill. So in a very small snapshot, we see, the mindset of King Tang of Shang. But really, I mean, who was King Tang, and why are we sort of reading about his basin inscription thousands of years later? Well, King Tang, his name was Zilu, but also recorded as other names like Cheng Tang in the historical texts. He was, in fact, the 14th ruler of the state of Shang. Now, the founding ancestor for this particular state was Xie, who was the Minister of Education for Shun, under Shun. And because of his meritorious service, Xie was bestowed the Principality of Shang, which became the name of the ruling house. And he was given the surname of Zi. We know, of course, that King Yao abdicated in favor of Shun. And King Shun later also found that his son was unworthy and abdicated in favor of a very virtuous minister by the name of Yu. King Yu founded what was known as the Xia dynasty, which lasted for over 400 years. So it was flourishing until the 17th ruler by the name of King Jie, who was despotic and dissolute. And as a result, the states were disordered and the state rulers turned away from King Jie. It's at this time that Cheng Tang, who was ruling the state of Shang, achieves sort of political eminence because of his mere moral superiority. So, we could see from the basin inscription that he's someone who's sort of constantly motivating himself to improve himself and cultivate. There's this really a wonderful story about Cheng Tang. Says that he was once outside of the city and he met a hunter who was sort of putting up nets in the sky in the four directions and hoping that he'd catch all of the birds. Cheng Tang took down the nets of three directions. And he said that, he hoped that birds who wanted to fly left or right could do so, and only victims of fate would be netted. Now, when the story spread to the other states, all of the state rulers admired Cheng Tang for his compassion, saying that his compassion extended to even the birds and the beasts. And so we can see that Cheng Tang, through this self-cultivation, trying to recover and manifest this enlightened virtue, was really sort of manifesting this compassion. But we also know, of course, that the enlightened virtue has an innate wisdom to know the difference between right and wrong, and is naturally attracted or fond of virtue. So when we cultivate ourselves, we look for, we can recognize, and we can value and be close to others of virtue. And this ability is seen in King Tang, this idea that he recognizes and values virtuous scholars and people. So it's quite apparent in a particular passage in the Analects. And this is a conversation first between a student of Confucius, Fan Shi, and Confucius. So Fan Shi asks Confucius about, what is humanity? Confucius simply replies, this means to love all others. And then Fan Shi asks about wisdom. Confucius says, wisdom is to be able to know others, to be able to know their character. But Fan Shi doesn't understand this answer about wisdom. And so Confucius further explains by providing, what a wise person would do is that they would appoint the upright and not give positions to those who are unprincipled. And by doing so, the upright, through their example, are able to transform those who are unprincipled. But Fan Shi still doesn't really understand. But by this time, it's too embarrassing to ask his teacher. So he leaves, and when he meets with his friend, Zi Xia, he asks Zi Xia, what did Confucius mean when he said this? Zi Xia replies by providing an example. And it's about Tang. So it says, when Tang ruled the world, he appointed Yi Ying, and those devoid of humanity disappeared. So Yi Ying was someone who was considered very virtuous. He was the chancellor to King Tang. And it shows us, of course, that King Tang had this wisdom. He had this good judgment of people's character because he was able to truly cultivate himself each and every day, as we saw. Now, there are two accounts of how Tang met Yi, and both of which are in the Shiji, the historical records. So the first account is that Yi was actually a servant. He was a cook in the Shang household, and every time he brought dishes to King Tang, or Chen Tang, yes, he wasn't the king at that time, he would sort of talk about politics and encourage him to follow the way of King Yao and King Shun, these sage rulers. And Tang recognized that this was no ordinary person, that this person was very politically astute, but also had virtue to really think about emulating these sages. And so ultimately, Tang promoted him. He appointed him as his right-hand man. So already that tells you a lot about Tang, because usually most people would look down on someone who is of lowly status, like a servant or a cook, for example. But in this case, Tang is able to give him the opportunity and also really be able to see him for his true talent and merits. So that's the first example or version. But the second account of what happened is recorded in historical records and the Mencius. And Mencius tells us that Yi Ying was actually a recluse. He was, farming in seclusion, and everyone knew that he was someone who was very wise. And King Tang, when he heard about Yi Ying, tried several times to invite him and convince him to be part of his government so that the people would benefit. So he presented him with gifts, but of course, Yi Ying would refuse. And it was up to 5 visits. So not only himself, but also he asked his ministers to go and try to convince this wise person to come and serve. Now, over time, of course, Yi Ying is moved by the sincerity of Tang, and he reconsiders, and ultimately is willing to provide use his experiences, his knowledge and skills for the sake of the state. And this is what Confucius records. He says that Yi Ying thought that if a single person in the Chinese kingdom at the time did not share or experience the benefits of good government in the tradition of King Yao and King Shun, these sage rulers, then he would take personal responsibility for it. And so it says, that he took upon himself the responsibility for the heavy weight of the world. So you can see that Ying has this very broad mindset where he's able to take on the responsibility of the peace and well-being of everyone in the state, and ultimately comes out to serve. And this partnership that is between Ying and King Tang is one of the most celebrated partnerships in Chinese history, in political history, in the sense that both of these leaders were really wanting to benefit the people. And so Ying himself is known as one of the greatest statesmen in pre-imperial China. Now, what happens later on is because of the vices of King Jie, the final ruler of the Xia dynasty, and the moral superiority of King or Cheng Tang in comparison, as well as coupled with the sound advice and counsel of Ying, Cheng Tang, along with the other states, ultimately overthrows the despotic King Jie and establishes the Shang dynasty. And shortly after establishing the Shang dynasty, King Tang makes this speech, which is recorded in the documents, one of the Confucian classics. And there's this particular line in there which really gives us an idea of King Tang's mindset. So it says, if people in the myriad regions have committed offences, let the punishment fall on me alone. If in my person as a king I have committed offences, do not hold the people of the myriad regions responsible. So you can see that, not only is he accountable for his own thoughts and actions, but also feels accountable for the actions and even the offences of everyone in his kingdom. Now, this is an incredible mindset, but, not one that's difficult to understand, given that we have now read the opening passage of the highest learning. So we know that, when we evaluate our thoughts, when we hold ourselves accountable and responsible, then we naturally have an influence on others through our example. So if the people around us we feel are not, improving, then actually it's really just a reflection on our own cultivation. So, in other words, we are responsible for the people around us. We should feel responsible because we should be the change that we wish to see in the world. So this is really the mindset of King Tang. And interestingly, you'll see that there are very amazing resonances and parallels with what Ying also thought as well, that both of these men have this wonderful way, this mindset of feeling like they're responsible and taking responsibility for the state, for the well-being of the people. So that's why they had this really wonderful partnership. So King Tang establishes the foundations of the Shang dynasty, which we know was a very flourishing and well-developed civilization. We know this through several sources, for example, the traditional historical texts, but also the ritual bronze vessels, the bones of which they were used in divination, so they're called the oracle bones, archaeological excavations and theoretical models. So the Shang dynasty existed, and we know this, that they were a very well-developed civilization. And certainly we can see that this was the legacy of someone like King Tang, who, through his moral excellence, really sort of laid the foundations. But his legacy was not only in his reign. We know, of course, that after he passed away, there were a series of very short reigns, and then ultimately his grandson, Taijia, takes the throne. But Taijia proves to be quite disordered and cruel. So what happens is that Ying, who's the veteran chancellor by this time, banishes Taijia to the memorial of his grandfather, King Tang, and allows him to sort of reflect on himself. Over time, Taijia, the young king, then sort of repents, and then Ying welcomes him back. Now, during this time, Ying writes several instructions that have been preserved and recorded in the documents, and the highest learning extracts one particular phrase in these instructions to the young king. And so Yi Ying tells Taijia that his grandfather, King Tang, was always mindful of this innate enlightened mandate. So the innate enlightened mandate is really the enlightened virtue. And being mindful is being constantly mindful and constantly realizing and recovering one's enlightened virtue, which, we could see from this idea of the basin inscription, but also throughout the many deeds and stories surrounding King Tang in the historical texts. So today we've covered this idea of making intention sincere, and we know that it's very much grounded in our thoughts at any particular moment, that we always have to ensure that we are in keeping and in harmony with our perfected knowledge, our conscience. We explained how there are flow-on effects to, our what's manifest outside, but also our well-being. And also through the story of King Tang, we know that this has flow-on effects. This sincere intentions has flow-on effects to the people around him, to really recruiting the best, the virtuous, and also ultimately providing order and peace and prosperity through the Shang dynasty, and leaving this lasting legacy. But if you think about it, the very basis of this lasting legacy is none other than the daily reminders, the daily moments. And, ultimately, it encourages us to make the most of all our moments, make the most of all of our thoughts in keeping our intention sincere. Okay, so that is today's lecture, and next week we'll talk about the other actions here. But as always, thank you very much for your attention, for listening, and hopefully we will meet again next week. So thank you very much.